Now, I have to say, I feel a little weird reviewing Dominant Species 3rd edition, just because the game has been around for a while, people already know it very well, people are comparing the details of this edition with the previous ones, and I cannot do anything of that sort, because I haven't played any previous edition. This is the first edition that I played. I discovered the game from this edition. Even in the depth of the cave where I've been living in the past couple of years, I still heard voices from the outside talking about this Dominant Species thing. I wanted to look into it at some point, and of course now with the 3rd edition I had the opportunity to do so. I have to say though that in my group nobody else knew it. I was the first player to bring the game in and teach it to the other people, so maybe there is hope. Maybe I'm not the last man on earth to learn about stuff, but still, I know that I'm pretty new to the game. You, the viewer, probably already know the game much better than I do, but if for whatever strange reason of yours you're curious to hear the opinions of a newcomer to the game, well, here we go. This is my video. You can just keep watching and you will learn about those opinions. This is how the world of the story looks like at the beginning of the game, with those terrain tiles right there, and with element discs that are placed on those tiles to represent the elements that are present in the tiles touching those elements and that the animals living in those tiles can exploit. Each player receives a mat representing the class of animals that that player is controlling. We have reptiles, mammals, arachnids, birds, insects, amphibians. There are 6 of them that you can choose from, and each class of animals has, well, first a nice reminder of major concepts in the game. These are very good, very well designed player aids, but also each class has a series of areas here where you keep track of the elements that at the present time your class of animals is able to exploit, is able to use. For example, the snakes start with 2 suns, 2 abilities, 2 degrees of ability to exploit, to use the sun to their advantage. As you can see, all animals start with some elements printed on their map, on their mats, but then later you will also be able to exploit more elements, and you simply place the discs representing the new elements on your mat. You may lose the ability of exploiting some elements, so this area may have discs being added and taken from throughout the game. Each animal, each player and each class of animals receives a series of components, cubes that are placed on the board to represent the species that that class of animals controls, and also the presence of those species in specific tiles, cylinders which are placed in specific areas of the board to reserve actions that the players will perform in the current turn, and then cones such as this one or that one. The player that places a cone there doesn't necessarily has the majority in terms of numbers in that tile, but is the player that can exploit the tile most efficiently. And you determine that by counting the number of matches between the symbols of the elements on your mat and the elements present in that tile. For example, right now the reptiles have 4 matches, because this symbol here matches 1 and 2, and this is the symbol 3 and 4. The mammals also have a presence in that tile, but the mammals start with this mat here, which has 2 meat symbols, but there's only a meat symbol there, so actually the mammals only have 2 matches with that tile, 1 and 2, and that's it. So the reptiles in this case have the dominance, and they place the cone there. When a tile is scored for points towards the end of a turn, the player that has dominance there also receives a card from a specific deck, and those cards from that deck can allow players to perform very powerful actions. The game is organized following a strict food chain that from strongest to weakest goes from mammals to reptiles, birds, amphibians, arachnids, and insects. Being higher than your opponent on the food chain is a great advantage because in scoring you break ties with all animals that are below you in the food chain. On the other hand, I guess that being high in the food chain makes you less alert because initiative for each turn is based on reverse food chain order. So at the beginning of the game, the insects, which are at the bottom of the food chain, go first, and the mammals that are at the top of the food chain go last. Now, the general idea is that each turn the players will place their action pawns on the available eyeball spaces that you see in this area, and there are more down here, I will show them to you in a minute. And players will alternate placing their pawns on these areas following initiative order. That means that going first is a great advantage because, as you can see, for some of these actions only there is a limited availability, and if you're going last, maybe you will not be able to execute some action that you want because all of the areas for that action have already been reserved by other players. When it is time to resolve the actions, if a player has reserved the initiative action, that player can move his class of animals by one space on the initiative track, basically by switching locations with the class on the left, so that player will have better initiative next turn. When you are resolving the adaptation action, the players that have a pawn there can choose one of these elements here, and then they can place that element on their mat. So this is how you acquire new elements. Yes, this is how you adapt to be able to use more resources. At the end of a turn, the elements that are still available there are slided to the next box, which is the regression box. After adaptation, you resolve regression, and that means that players will lose an element matching the ones in that box from their mat if they have elements that they can lose. They can never lose the ones printed on the box, but they can lose the ones that are placed here. Again, in case the regression action targets those elements. But if you placed your action pawn there, then for each pawn that you have there, you are protected from the regression in one element, and the reptiles have their symbol printed there because the reptiles always have a free protection each turn from regression. Abundance. You choose, if you selected that action, you choose one of the elements available here and you place it on the board. At the end of the turn, the remaining elements are slided to the wasteland box, and when you resolve the wasteland action, you eliminate all elements matching those in that box from the board that are touching a tundra tile. These are the tundra tiles. If you placed your pawn there, then as your action, you can remove one of those discs, and that limits the effect of wasteland on elements adjacent to tundra. If there are elements here at the end of a turn, you slide that down, and then next turn you will have the depletion action available. If a player reserved the depletion action, the player can remove an element from the board that matches the element in the depletion action. So basically you can eliminate resources that other players are using, and that in some cases can be really mean. Glaciation. When you resolve the glaciation action, you take a tundra tile from that pile and you add it to the board adjacent to one or more tundra tiles that are already there. You score points. The more tiles of tundra are adjacent to the one that you are adding, the more points you get. Also, the tundra will destroy species that are in that tile. There are just several effects that come from that. Glaciation only hits once per turn, so even if multiple players have their pawns there, you only resolve the action reserved by the leftmost player, and then at the end of the turn you slide down all the action points, all the action pawns. So sometimes you will need to reserve your glaciation action in advance, a couple of turns in advance. Speciation, you placed your pawn there, good for you. Now you can add species, that means cubes, to the board in axis adjacent to one of the elements here, the elements that you selected. In this case, the arachnids could add species, cubes, to axes that are adjacent to a seed element on the board. Then you have Wanderlust. If you reserved that action, you can select one of the terrain tiles available for that turn. You place it on the board adjacent to other terrain. You score points for the number of terrain tiles that are adjacent to the tile that you just added. Also, you choose an element that is still available for the Wanderlust action and you add it to the tile that you just placed on the board. Migration is what allows your animals to move, and the number on the eyeball area where you place your pawn indicates the number of species of cubes that you can move. Birds can move up to 2 spaces. Competition is when animals eat each other. If you reserved that action, you will notice that each eyeball space touches 3 types of terrain. That one, for example, touches wetland, desert, and tundra. All of these areas touch tundra. Well, for each of these areas, you choose one type of terrain on the board in which you have at least a species and an opponent also has a species, and you remove a species of the opponent. Finally, domination. Domination is when you score points, so that means that you do not score automatically. You need to reserve the area, an area on this track if you want to score points. To score points, you will select a tile, you deploy the selected the action, chooses a tile on the board, and then you look at the numbers printed on that tile. The first number is the number of points earned by the player that has the majority, the numerical majority on the tile. So the highest number of species, food chain is used to break ties. The second number is number of points that goes to the second player in terms of majority, and then in this case you also have a third player. Other areas have even more opportunities to score, but other areas may have less. For example, in the desert, only 2 players will get to score. Also, this is when the player that has dominance receives a card from this area here. And then the card will be replaced by a new card from a deck at the end of the turn. At the end of the turn, you check for extinction, that is, you eliminate all species that are in excess that cannot support them anymore, excess that do not have any element that species the class can use. Then you have survival, the player that has number of species on tundra tiles wins the survival phase and gains points accordingly, and then you reseed. This is when you slide discs down, you add new discs, you move glaciation markers. You're simply reorganizing the area here. And then you just repeat the procedure with another turn with cards that are added to this area to replace the ones that have been used during the domination phase, and the game continues this way turn after turn until all cards from the deck that these cards come from are exhausted. The last card in that deck triggers the end of the game. At the point you score all tiles on the board one last time, again following the scoring priorities indicated on the tiles, and after that the player with the highest amount of points is the winner. I enjoyed the designs by Chad Jensen in the past, such as Urban Sprawl or Fighting Formations, and I enjoyed this one too, and actually I can see the family resemblance. All of these games have very interesting and often innovative concepts that feel a little abstract, a little fiddly at first when you're just learning the concepts. Not that they're difficult per se, but sometimes you have a lot of little things that you have to remember and just procedure that are new and you need to become familiar with. And it takes a little bit before they all click together, but that is not too far in the future. It doesn't take that long before that happens, and at that point you start seeing the flow of the game, you start moving from the rules to the experience, and then you have gameplay, and then you have a gameplay that is extremely rich and is full of levels of depth that players discover as the game progresses. More and more things that they can do, more and more things that they should be aware of and should be working to prevent from happening. Just a game that has many different factors that work together. And actually I really like this. All the elements in the game seems to be so well connected to each other and so well balanced, not just in terms of, say, the classes being balanced because some are good at something and not at something else, and other classes are good at something else and not at something else. Not just a balance there, but for example, a very interesting balance in the trade-offs that you have to encounter. If you do something, you cannot do something else. If you're investing in something, then you're losing something somewhere else. You have this constant factor not being able to do and to achieve all that you want, and you always have these tough decisions that you have to make about what are the options still available to you, how you should invest your resources, and how you should deal with the other players. This is really a game, I think, that simulates well this idea of nature not being a vacuum, but everything being so interdependent. Animals and elements and changing environment and different species depending on one another, struggling against one another. I like this, for example, there is strong competition. This is a race to prevail in the race for natural selection, of course, and that also means that species are going to be aggressive. They are going to try to get in each other's way in a large variety of ways. And this also results in, I think, a certain level of aggressiveness. I don't know if aggressive is the word. Definitely of direct competition and confrontation that is pretty high in this game. In sum, this is a design that I enjoyed a lot. I found it thematically, I found it exciting, I found it full of levels of depth and full of meaningful decisions that you can discover. I love the strong interaction that is crucial among players and that forces them to change the type of interaction in different parts of the game. So overall, I just found it to be a very engaging experience, definitely an immersive experience. I have to say that the game can be long. A game with a high number of players can easily last 4 or 5 hours, which is still on the short side if you're a war gamer, but for the rest of the world, for the normal population, that may be sometimes a little too much. I know that that's definitely an amount of time that is more than what you invest in a regular Euro game. Again, I'm not sure that this is a Euro game anyway, so just don't be fooled into expecting that this is something that it is not. It is a game that definitely has some Euro game elements. At the same time, it has a certain war game feel, but overall, it is a game that is competitive, that is exciting, and that is immersive. So a game that I enjoyed and that everybody in my group enjoyed too.